Hey, it's Zoe. What comes to mind when you think of Navy SEALs? Brawn, badass, buff, bulldozers, really high performance, scary dudes. Yeah, all of that and more. And I have a little bit of an obsession with Navy SEALs. And in today's episode, we'll review some of the literature, some of the books I've been reading, and what we can use out of them as leaders. Let's do this thing. Or as they say in the SEALs, hoo-yah!
Welcome to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast, your source of strategies and insights to make you a better leader. Influence, improve, inspire.
Hey, welcome back. What a week last week. It was evidence-based leadership with my Leaders Edge mastermind group, and we had a specialist, Mark Hocknell, come down from Brizzy to run a workshop with my mastermind members. And the key takeaway from that, well, there was plenty, but I think probably the foundational piece of that is to start defining your goals as results. Now, this sounds pretty simple, and you kind of might be scratching your head going, well, what do you mean by that? Well, if we start thinking about goals instead of projects, things that we need to do, we're thinking about the end result. So once we do this project, what does it mean? What and the why of this? And I think this is pretty astonishing once we get our head around how we do this, because it gets us focused on the why of what we're doing and not just the projects. And from a strategic point of view and from an engagement point of view, this is revolutionary. So that was pretty cool. This week, it's all about breakfasts. I have a breakfast tomorrow here in Canberra with CEOs of not-for-profits, and we're looking at sustainability and business models. So how can not-for-profits, who are usually charity-based, transform their businesses and accomplish sustainable business income? It's one of the key challenges for all community sector organizations, is that ongoing funding piece. That's tomorrow. And then I'm heading up to Brisbane on Wednesday, and I'm doing a breakfast there on the 9 critical steps to avoid becoming disposable and how to future-proof your position. So if you're in Brisbane and you want to come along to that breakfast, just get in touch with my assistant, Crystal. hello@innercompass.com.au. And if you want me to come to your city to run a breakfast, just get in touch. Zoe@innercompass.com.au. I love to travel and I love to meet my listeners and so on. Love to hear from you. It is absolutely freezing here in Canberra, I have to say. After being in the north the week before that, in beautiful Darwin and up on in the Kakadu National Park, coming back to sub-zero temperatures. Today it was -9. I'm thinking ahead. I'm thinking ahead to the Larapinta, where I'll be back out of Alice Springs in September with another group of the Leaders Edge Mastermind. And this is a group, if you're curious about it, focuses on developing global impact on people, place, and planet. And we go hard on how to lead yourself and how to lead your team, and most importantly, how to lead your organization and lead for the world. So we focus on developing skills, thinking, and attitude to be successful leaders. Would love to have you on that if you're interested. And going out to Larapinta is just one of the excellent components of that program. All right, so I promise, Navy SEALs. Why Navy SEALs? Well, if you remember a few episodes ago, I was speaking about self-sabotage and what happens when you fall off the wagon and you lose your cornerstone habits. Well, I'm pleased to say that I am back on track with core habits. Meditation is back on, exercise is back on. In fact, on my birthday, which was July 1st, I set up a challenge, a push-up challenge. I started with 10 push-ups that morning, and every day I added another push-up. I am now up to 25 push-ups. Yes, that's proper push-ups on your toes, just after adding 1 per day. And I love this idea of incremental improvement. And all of this relates back to Navy SEALs, because to have a Navy SEAL type of performance, you need a huge mindset and you need a huge commitment to performance. I think my obsession with SEALs came, and I was thinking about this, like, how did I get onto this? I don't know anybody who's in the Navy SEALs. I do have quite a few friends who have been in the military, and their experience fascinates me. I think it was when I was going through cancer in 2005, and I lay a lot on the couch feeling horrendous. My body pretty beat up from both the chemo and from the surgery that I had. And I was so far away from being a top performer at that point. Just before I got cancer, I was training for my 6th marathon. And I had just completed how long was that run? About 37-kilometer run. And at the end of it, I just stopped running. About a kilometer to go, I was spent. And I never do that. I always finish a run. But on this particular day, this is before I knew I had cancer, I just stopped. And my husband, who I was training with, ran ahead of me, and then he turned around and came back. He's like, "Are you okay?" I'm like, "No, I just can't do this." And it was a surprise to me because my body was dictating what was going on. About a week later, I found out I had cancer. And as I went through my treatment, lying on that couch, I looked to top physical performance as an inspiration to get back to health. And it was May or June, July, through that winter period, that was winter here in Australia, I watched the tennis. I'm watching peak performers like Roger Federer ace through the tennis at Wimbledon, which is just completed last night, actually. Congratulations, Novak Djokovic. And I watched, before he became known as a jug cheat, I watched Lance Armstrong. And I watched Lance Armstrong power up the mountains in the Tour de France. And this was incredibly inspiring for me. Just the physical feats of being able to conquer huge physical challenges like the Tour de France was something that inspired me to keep going every day. And each day at that point, it was to get outside and walk a little bit. At first, it was just 300 meters out for 10 minutes, that kind of stuff. And it was so far from having run 38 kilometers or a couple of marathons. But that's where I was. That incremental piece of focus and continued improvement kind of led me to the Navy SEALs. Because if you're thinking about top performance, the Navy SEALs are renowned for having some of the toughest mental and physical training hurdles to get through if you're trying to get into the SEALs. So I started reading a little bit about that, It's like, what does it take to do this kind of Navy SEAL stuff? And what is the training regimen? And what is the challenge of Hell Week, as they call it, which is 7 days of not much sleeping and eating and just perpetual bombardment of stress after stress, of carrying logs and sitting in cold water, of doing endless push-ups and so on, just to test the breaking point. Surprisingly, it's often not the body that breaks, but the spirit and the mental attitude that makes the difference. Well, sure, there's injuries and that sort of thing, but those who survive and get through it all, it largely comes down to their mental attitude. And that's what I'm really fascinated by, because if we can harness some of that focus, some of the secrets the SEALs have learned for undertaking and surviving in the most extreme of circumstances, not just in training, but in their deployments around the world in very hostile environments, then we could be better as leaders and as individuals. So that's why I'm fascinated. So I've been reading heaps and watching different Netflix movies and so on. I think the first level of stories that we can go to for exploration are the war stories. And there's heaps of those that have come out in recent years. There's The Red Circle by Brandon Webb, which is about, Brandon was a sniper trainer, and he talks about in his book about his experience in the SEALs, what led him into the SEALs, how he lived through the SEALs, and how he became a sniper trainer himself, and how he changed the focus of the training. And then there's just the war stories. No Easy Day, American Sniper, Lone Survivor. These are all awesome stories. And they tell the tales of men, largely, because there are no female SEALs at this point, who undergo these experiences together. Some survive and some don't. And what does it take to get through that, this brotherhood? By the way, I'll put a list of all these books in the show notes, which are zoerouth.com/podcast/SEALs, SEALS. So the war stories are the first thing to go to, and they're good for entertainment value and just to provoke your thinking about, could I do that? Would I be up to that? And what does it take to endure the onslaught of danger day in, day out, not knowing if you're ever going to see your family again? And many don't. So that's the first level. The most recent book I read, second most recent book, is called Unbreakable, A Navy SEAL's Way of Life by Tom Shea. And it's a recent book, and he was in the SEALs for 17 years, I think. And he lived through a lot of combat in Afghanistan. And his story is an interesting one, and he's come through that experience, and his business 10 years on since he left the SEALs is about leadership development. And his main premise is about the internal dialogue, capitalized internal dialogue, as the foundational point for making it in the SEALs and in life in general. And the book's pretty good. It's an interesting story about what goes on in a man's mind when he's away fighting and what keeps him going. And for him, his internal dialogue was critical, as was his relationship to his second wife, Stacy, who he calls Spartan Wife. And what's fascinating about this particular story is for a Navy SEAL, from his point of view, to survive, you need to have a wife who totally embraces what you do and believes in your purpose as a warrior and supports the violent nature that you have as a warrior. And I thought that was an interesting point of view because, sure, in the past there has been lots of warrior women who have been warriors themselves, and plenty of women in many different countries who support their men going out to fight the good fight. You don't often hear it in the Navy SEAL circles. Often you hear the other side of things, the lonely wives left alone to hold the fort, as opposed to the Spartan wives who hold the fort while their men go to fight for the country. I think what's also interesting about Unbreakable is the way that Tom Shea puts it. It's really, he describes a contemporary warrior in all the base, not impulsive, but warrior nature, I guess, which is within all of us. But he lives as a Navy SEAL, and basically it comes down to food, fighting, and think of the other F word that starts with an F and ends with a K. So food, fighting, and ucking is a critical part of the warrior ethos and is that fundamental aggressive experience that is within all of us, and you need to harness as a Navy SEAL if you're going to survive in that kind of environment. So I thought that was an interesting book just to explore what was that reality like when you lived through that. What made me curious though is like, how do you go after you leave the military when you have all this pumped up primal ethos boiling within you and then translate that to a civilian life? It's not an easiest thing. Tom Shea would say it's all about your internal dialogue and you just change priorities. And I suspect it's quite a lot different if you have that much testosterone and that much aggression running through your body and you're used to the adrenaline and exhilaration that comes through living on a knife's edge to going back to civilian life is one of the reasons why a lot of ex-service people struggle. So that's Unbreakable by Tom Shea. The third set of books are by Jocko Willink. Now, this guy is probably the biggest and the baddest of the badasses when it comes to Navy SEALs. If you just Google him, Jocko, Jocko, Willink, Willink, he is one scary-looking dude, and I think he harps it up for his positioning. However, like, you can see this guy, you can see why he lasted 20 years in the Navy SEALs. Like, he just is one tough son of a bitch. And I read two of his books, Discipline Equals Freedom and Extreme Ownership. Let me talk about the second one first. Extreme Ownership. It's a business book. It's a business book coupled with war stories. And it's actually quite well done, I have to say. Like, it's quite well structured. So the way he sets out the book is there's key principles that feed his philosophy of leadership that have come out of his military experience of 20 years in the SEALs. And he starts each chapter about his experience in the battle for Ramadi in Iraq. And each story has a key business or leadership principle. So the war stories are fascinating in themselves, and then he translates it to business environment where he tells other case studies / stories, which are compilations often of his experiences with different leaders in different organizations and how they apply in the business context. So it's really good from that point of view as a general leadership book with an edgy, fascinating look at the day in and day out challenges of Navy SEALs in really difficult, volatile situations. So I enjoyed that book. The key principle of extreme ownership is take responsibility for everything in your world. No matter what happens, you have something to do about it. And there's always something to learn from the situation. So through humility, you can take extreme ownership for your life. Don't complain about anything because you are in charge of everything. And it doesn't matter if somebody else did stuff to you, you still have extreme ownership. I like this as a philosophy. It's something that I believe in as well. And it's a difference between being a victim and being a learner and captain of your own ship. So extreme ownership resonates for me from a war story perspective and also from a leadership perspective. The leadership piece, though, I have to say it's more about execution of leadership plans as opposed to high-level strategic thinking and some of the advanced theories of leadership. His other book, Discipline Equals Freedom. This book is like the experience of basically getting a kick in the pants. And I quite like it, actually, because you can imagine this big, tough guy, Jocko, just shouting at you, going, just get it done. And there's this unwavering focus about getting it done. And in the context of the book, it's about the discipline applying to your physical training, essentially. So for me, trying to reboot my physical strength and my physical focus, this was a useful book. And that sort of kicked me off from the push-up challenge also. So I like it. It's a pretty easy little book to flick through and get through it. It's got advice on nutrition, which is basically do a paleo diet. And it's got an outline of different physical challenges from the extreme beginner to the toughest road warrior you can imagine. So that's fascinating in itself. So I'd advise, I'd pick that one up for sure. It's an interesting kick in the pants. Yeah. Now, my favorite author probably so far when it comes to practical application and mindset training is Mark Divine's work. Mark Divine, Divine, and he's written a few books. The first one I read was Unbeatable Mind, which you can tell reading it is a self-published book because it's a little bit loose in some parts, but very practical when it comes to harnessing the power of the mind. And I think Mark Divine that does this heaps better than Tom Shea in Unbreakable. And Unbreakable, Tom Shea, all he does is says your internal dialogue is important to pay attention to, but he doesn't give any practical tools to shape it. Mark Divine does just that. So in Unbeatable Mind, he goes through a bunch of exercises. And in his second book, Way of the Seal, it's a lot more detailed and structured. And both those books together have fabulous exercises in terms of meditation focus and of journal practice and of being very deliberate and intentional about your focus in your world and your life as it pertains to personal goals, physical goals, etc. It's a very holistic practice. What I also find interesting about Mark Divine is that he practiced a number of different martial arts, became black belt in a number of them, became a yoga instructor, and has incorporated it all into his own business, which is basically called Seal Fit. And Seal Fit it's open to civilians, but it's a place where you can go and do this extreme training. And it has all of the SEAL requirements or standards that you can train to. And his book, 8 Weeks to SEAL Fit, is an on-ramp to that. So it's how you can train like a SEAL. So somebody who's fascinated with extreme performance, I find this book incredibly interesting. All his books are great. So there you go. So my recommendations for reading are, if you just want war stories, go for it. Red Circle by Brandon Webb is pretty good. No Easy Day is pretty good. American Sniper also pretty good. If you want a kick in the pants, then and an easy read, Jocko Willink's book, Discipline Equals Freedom, is a good little hit for that. If you want an extensive read about actually what to do to harness your mindset and the physical applications to that, go with Mark Divine's work. In prioritized order, I go Way of the Seal, 8 Weeks to SEAL Fit, and Unbeatable Mind. That's my recommendation. If you have other Navy SEAL related books and movies that you'd like to recommend, I'd love to hear them. Just write a comment on the podcast page or send me an email, zoe@innercompass.com.au. In the meantime, live well, lead well.